formation of great societies, there is this almost irresistible temptation to treat history like a clean, perfectly drafted blueprint.
Oh, absolutely. We love a neat narrative.
Right. Like we look at a timeline and think, oh, the visionary leader arrives, the laws are written, the factions miraculously unite, and civilization just, marches forward.
Yeah, we just smooth out all the rough edges because the end result feels so inevitable to us now.
Exactly. But the truth is, when you step into the reality of 7th century Arabia,
Hmm.
and specifically the city of Yathrib, which would of course become Medina, that neat blueprint goes entirely out the window.
Completely out the window.
I mean, you are suddenly standing in an absolute powder keg.
It is the absolute definition of building a society on the edge of a blade. The sheer human complexity of what was happening in Medina really defies any simplistic historical narrative we try to force onto it.
Yeah.
Because you have to picture a geographic and cultural landscape that is just scarred by decades of brutal civil war.
Right. Just generations of trauma.
Exactly. Overlapping tribal loyalties, shifting economic power dynamics. It was incredibly fragile.
Which is exactly why we are taking you there today. We are going back to one of the most pivotal moments in human history to explore a highly detailed historical account of the Medina period.
It's such an intense period to study.
It really is. And this deep dive, it's an exploration into the life of Prophet Muhammad, the legacy of the greatest man who ever lived. But we're going to look at this through a very specific lens.
A very narrow, highly pressurized window.
Right. We are focusing specifically on the turbulent time between the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Uhud.
And defining that window is so crucial for you to understand the stakes here. I mean, the Battle of Badr was an earth-shattering event in the region.
It really upset the entire world order of that area.
It did. You had this small, poorly armed group of Muslim refugees who completely defeated the reigning superpower of the Arabian Peninsula, which was the Quraysh of Mecca.
Just a massive upset.
A total upset. And the shockwaves of that completely destabilized the political equilibrium. Suddenly, this new community in Medina wasn't just like a fringe religious movement anymore.
Right. They were a legitimate, formidable state.
Exactly. And with that recognition came an immense, suffocating target on their backs.
I mean, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone living in Medina at that exact moment. The tension must have been palpable.
Oh, you could probably cut it with a knife.
Yeah. You know the superpower you just embarrassed is actively plotting revenge. You know there are factions within your own city who are furious about the shifting power dynamics.
Right, the internal threat is just as big as the external one.
So our goal today is to examine the unseen psychological warfare, the complex relationships, and the profound, just mind-blowing emotional intelligence required to keep this nascent community from tearing itself apart.
And to really grasp the magnitude of that leadership, we have to look at the unprecedented way the society was structured on day one.
Okay, let's go back to day one then.
Right. So when the Prophet arrived in Medina, he fundamentally disrupted the traditional model of power.
How so?
Well, in the ancient world, and certainly in the tribal systems of Arabia, power was entirely about dominance. You conquer a territory, you subjugate the weaker factions, and you dictate the terms.
It's a zero-sum game.
Exactly. But his approach was entirely different. He didn't arrive as a conquering warlord. He arrived as a community builder, an arbitrator, and he immediately drafted a covenant.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that covenant for a second, because I feel like just calling it a treaty doesn't quite do it justice.
No, treaty is way too small a word.
Right. It wasn't just a ceasefire.
Not at all. It was effectively a constitution. This document treated all the inhabitants of Medina, so the Muslim refugees from Mecca, the local Arab tribes, and the established Jewish tribes as equal citizens.
Which is huge.
It's massive. It created a new pluralistic Islamic state. It guaranteed freedom of religion, mutual defense, and shared responsibility for the city. Yeah, and he approached the relationship with the Jewish tribes, the people of the book, with the expectation of common ground. He dealt with them as citizens with inherent rights.
So there were no hidden agendas, no subjugation.
None. Completely devoid of hidden agendas.
It's such a radical concept for a society where, up until that point, your only protection came from your bloodline.
Your tribe was your entire insurance policy.
Right. And suddenly, protection comes from an ideological framework of citizenship.
Yeah.
But, human nature is rarely as ideal as the laws we write.
Unfortunately, yes.
And the sources provide this deeply intimate, frankly chilling story that shows how that open hand was met privately by some factions.
This is one of the most fascinating accounts from this era.
It really is. It comes from a woman named Safiya, who was just a young girl at the time, though, she would later become the prophet's wife.
Yeah, and her account gives us this rare psychological window into the leadership of the opposing factions. Safiya was the daughter of Huyai ibn Akhtab.
He was the chief of the Banu Nadir tribe, right?
Yes, exactly. And she describes this family dynamic where she was like the absolute center of her father's world. And her uncle Abu Yasir's world, too. She was deeply loved, just completely doted upon.
She specifically mentions that whenever they were around, she was the first thing they paid attention to.
Always.
So she paints this picture of a very affectionate household. But then, on the day the prophet arrives in Medina, her father and her uncle leave early in the morning to observe him.
Right. They want to see this man who has disrupted the entire social fabric of the city.
So Safiya waits for them all day. They don't return until sunset. And when they finally walk through the door, she runs up to greet them, fully expecting to be scooped up like she always is.
But they completely ignore her.
Yeah.
And the physical description she provides here is incredibly telling. She says they were staggering.
Like they were physically wounded.
Yes. They were moving with this heavy, profound exhaustion. But it wasn't the physical exhaustion of labor. It was the crushing weight of a paradigm-shifting realization.
Because they had just observed a man they had anticipated for a very long time.
Exactly.
So Safiya overhears them having this quiet, really intense conversation. The uncle, Abu Yasir, asks her father, "Is that he then? Is he the one prophesied in our books?"
And her father, the chief, replies simply, yes.
Which is a heavy thing to admit.
Very heavy. And the uncle presses further. He asks, how will you relate to him? What are you going to do?
And the father responds, and this is the chilling part. He says, "By Allah, I will be his enemy for as long as I live."
I mean, this exchange is just a masterclass in the tragedy of the human ego.
It really is.
Because you have to understand the context here. The Jewish tribes in Medina had long anticipated the arrival of a final prophet. They had even told the local Arab tribes that when this prophet arrived, they would follow him and gain victory over their enemies.
Right. But their expectation was that this prophet would come from their own lineage.
Yes, from the descendants of Isaac.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around this, because they aren't going home and saying, "This guy is a fraud. We exposed him."
No, not at all.
They're looking at each other, confirming that he fits every single description in their scriptures, confirming that he is the truth, and then consciously choosing to declare a lifelong war against him anyway.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, how does a person look the truth right in the eye and choose destruction?
Because accepting him meant surrendering their ethnic and tribal supremacy. The prophet was an Arab, a descendant of Ishmael.
Oh.
So for Huyai ibn Akhtab, acknowledging this truth meant subordinating his own leadership and his tribe's prestigious status to someone outside their lineage.
Just pride.
It was a rejection born purely of envy. In the psychological framework of the time, this is categorized as the most profound and devastating form of disbelief.
Disbelieving when you have absolute certainty.
Exactly. Knowing the truth and bearing it anyway.
It's the ultimate sunk cost fallacy mixed with toxic pride. And, we see micro versions of this cognitive dissonance in daily life all the time.
Oh, for sure.
Like you realize halfway through an argument that you are completely wrong, but admitting it feels like a death to your ego, so you double down and just burn the relationship to the ground.
We've all been there.
Right. But in this historical context, a tribal leader doubling down doesn't just ruin a relationship. It quietly sets the stage for treason.
Massive state-level treason.
So as a leader, how do you manage a state when the people smiling at you in the marketplace and signing your mutual defense pacts have privately vowed your destruction?
Well, you are identifying the invisible, crushing pressure of this period. The prophet was operating in good faith. He was strictly upholding the terms of the covenant.
He couldn't just arrest people for their private thoughts.
Exactly. He couldn't act against them based on their private feelings or whispers. He had to lead through visible public action.
That requires so much patience.
Legendary patience. He managed this immense psychological current with a profound, quiet resilience, just waiting for the hidden animosity to either dissolve through his continued fairness or to reveal itself through an overt breach of the law.
And of course, that private animosity couldn't remain static for long. It began to bleed into the streets.
It always does.
The people who wanted this new society to fail realized they couldn't just attack the Muslims physically. They were bound by the Mutual Defense Pact.
Right, an open attack would be suicidal at that point.
So they decided to attack the sociological foundation of the community instead.
Hmm.
They targeted the newly forged brotherhood between the Arab tribes of Medina, the Aus, and the Khazraj.
And to really grasp why this was their target, we have to explain the brutal history of these two tribes.
It was a long history of violence, right?
Horrific violence. For over 100 years, the Aus and the Khazraj were locked in this cycle of devastating blood feuds. Just a few years prior to the Prophet's arrival, they fought the Battle of Bu'ath.
Which I understand was essentially a mutual slaughter.
That's exactly what it was. It depleted their leadership, ruined their economy, and left a deeply, deeply traumatized populace.
They were exhausted, just bled dry.
Completely. But then Islam enters the city, the message takes root, and you have this incredible, almost supernatural reconciliation.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. Men who had killed each other's brothers and fathers were now sitting shoulder to shoulder.
Yes. Sharing wealth, treating each other as family. It was a level of social cohesion that had never been seen in the peninsula.
And that cohesion was deeply threatening to the old guard.
Very much so.
Which brings us to a man named Shaz ibn Qays.
Right, Shaz ibn Qays. He was an older, very influential man in Medina who looked at this new unity and literally felt physically sickened by it.
He hated seeing them get along.
He despised it because he understood the mechanics of power in a tribal society. If the Aus and the Khazraj are united, his faction's leverage completely disappears.
His entire influence relied on their division.
Exactly. Divide and conquer.
So he decides to break them apart. And the method he uses is so fascinating. He doesn't hire mercenaries. He doesn't plot an assassination.
No, he does something much more insidious.
He targets their trauma. He finds a young man and tells him to go sit with a mixed group of Aus and Khazraj and simply recite poetry.
But specifically, poetry about the Battle of Bu'ath.
Right, and we have to pause here and explain the function of poetry in 7th century Arabia, because I think a modern listener might be confused by that.
Yeah, it wasn't just aesthetic art. It wasn't someone reading a sonnet in a coffee shop.
No.
It was the historical record. It was the media. It was the psychological conditioning of the people. It carried the emotional weight of their ancestors.
So let's contextualize that for today. This young man reciting poetry is the 7th century equivalent of a highly targeted viral deepfake.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
Think about how modern algorithms feed people hyper-specific content designed to trigger political or racial outrage,
Right.
bypassing their logic and going straight to the brainstem.
Right. It hijacks your emotions before you can even think.
Exactly. Shaz ibn Qays was essentially running a 7th century troll farm. He was weaponizing an oral tradition. He knew that the rhythm and the rhyme of these specific verses would instantly resurrect the smell of blood.
The grief for their dead fathers.
Yes, and the primal urge for revenge.
The medium of poetry completely bypassed their newly formed spiritual bonds and struck directly at their unhealed generational trauma.
So the young man sits among them and starts reciting.
Yeah, he recites verses praising the heroes of the Aus, and then verses mocking the dead of the Khazraj.
And it works perfectly.
Too perfectly. The temperature in the gathering rises instantly, the men start debating, the debate turns into shouting, and the shouting turns into a revival of their old tribal identities.
Within minutes, years of peacemaking just dissolve. They stand up, they hurl insults, they pull out their weapons.
They literally challenge each other to meet at the lava tracks outside the city to resume the war.
They are about to slaughter each other. Yeah. It just shows how incredibly fragile human unity is when the underlying wounds are deliberately scratched.
It's terrifying how fast it unraveled.
But word of this impending disaster reaches the Prophet, and he rushes to the scene with the Muslim emigrants from Mecca.
And this is where we have to analyze his response, because it's legendary. A typical political leader or a general facing a mutiny would respond with overwhelming force.
Right. They would bring in the guards, arrest the instigators, threaten executions, and reassert dominance.
Exactly. Rule by fear to restore order.
But he doesn't do that at all. He steps between these armed, furious men, and he delivers an appeal that is entirely emotional.
It's a heart-wrenching plea.
He says, "O Muslims, remember Allah, remember Allah. Will you act as pagans while I am present among you after Allah has guided you to Islam and honored you thereby and made a clean break with paganism and delivered you from disbelief and made you friends?"
Notice the specific phrasing there, while I am present among you.
That line gives me chills.
It's incredibly powerful. He is anchoring their chaotic emotions to his physical presence and the profound love they hold for him.
He isn't lecturing them on the legality of what they're doing.
No, he is reminding them of the sheer relief they felt when they escaped the darkness of their blood feuds. He is basically asking them, are you really willing to trade the grace of this brotherhood for the exhaustion of your old hatred?
It's an intervention rooted in such profound empathy. He knew they were being manipulated.
He saw right through the trap.
He knew the anger wasn't organic to their new state, it was a ghost from their past. And the reaction from the men is immediate.
The veil of manipulation lifts almost instantly.
They realize they have fallen into a psychological trap set by their enemies. They drop their weapons, they begin to weep, and they just embrace one another.
They recognize it as a satanic whisper, a deliberate subversion of their peace.
But, this event acted as a massive stress test for the society. It proved that internal unity was not a static achievement.
No, it required constant active defense against psychological warfare.
And it also signaled to the hidden enemies in Medina that words and poetry alone weren't going to be enough to collapse the state. The prophet's emotional tether to his people was just too strong.
Which means the provocations had to escalate.
Right. If they couldn't manipulate the Muslims into killing each other, they had to force a physical confrontation.
They had to test the actual legal boundaries of the Mutual Defense Covenant we talked about earlier.
This brings us to the crucible of the marketplace.
The marketplace in Medina was the central nervous system of the city.
It's where everyone gathered.
Exactly. It was where all the tribes, Muslims, Jews, polytheists, interacted daily. And the primary goldsmiths and merchants of this market were a Jewish tribe called the Banu Qaynuqa.
And the Banu Qaynuqa were heavily armed, very wealthy, and notoriously arrogant.
They were very confident in their military prowess.
Right. They had been openly mocking the Muslims after the victory at Badr, essentially saying, you defeated the Quraysh because they didn't know how to fight. If you fought us, you'd know what real men are.
So the tension is already simmering. The pot is about to boil over.
And then a Muslim woman goes to their section of the market to sell some goods. She sits down at a jeweler's shop, and while she is distracted, the shop owner commits a profoundly violating act.
It's awful. He secretly pins the lower hem of her dress to the back of her garment.
It is a deliberate, malicious prank designed entirely to humiliate her.
Utterly degrading.
So when she stands up to leave, her garment lifts, and she is exposed in the middle of a crowded marketplace.
And the shopkeepers just burst into laughter.
She screams, and a Muslim man who is nearby sees this happen. He sees the deliberate violation of her honor, and in a sudden surge of protective rage, he strikes and kills the shopkeeper.
And instantly, the other men of the Banu Qaynuqa swarm the Muslim man and murder him.
Let's break down the mechanics of what just happened, because this isn't just a tragic escalation of a prank.
No, we have to look at this through the lens of 7th century Arabian tribal law and under the explicit terms of the Constitution of Medina. Under those laws, this was an act of high treason.
Okay, wait, I need you to explain that.
Yeah.
Because I understand it's a terrible crime. But a single shop owner does this. A fight breaks out, 2 people die. Why is this considered high treason by an entire tribe?
That's a good question.
Isn't it an overreaction to view this as a state-level crisis?
Well, that is a very modern way of looking at individual crime versus state conflict.
Fair enough.
In that era, the concept of collective responsibility was absolute. When a member of a tribe commits an act of violence or violation in public, and the rest of the tribe supports him, which they did by murdering the Muslim man who intervened, the entire tribe has adopted that action.
They co-signed it.
Exactly. Furthermore, the covenant explicitly guaranteed the physical protection and honor of all citizens. By publicly stripping a woman of her honor and killing her defender, the Banu Qaynuqa weren't just committing a localized crime, they were actively tearing up the treaty.
Okay.
They were declaring in public that the laws of the Islamic State did not apply to them.
I see. If the prophet ignores this or just treats it as a minor misdemeanor, the covenant becomes worthless paper.
Exactly. Every faction in the city would realize there are no consequences for violating the Muslims. The authority of the nascent state would collapse instantly.
So the prophet had no choice but to respond decisively to maintain the security of the city.
He had to. He mobilizes the Muslim forces and marches on the fortress of the Banu Qaynuqa, placing them under siege.
And a siege in this era is just a brutal waiting game.
It is. The Banu Qaynuqa locked themselves inside their heavily fortified strongholds. They likely assumed they could outlast the Muslims, or that their historic Arab allies in Medina would come to their rescue.
So this siege lasts for 15 intense, agonizing days. But the fascinating part of this conflict isn't the military strategy.
No, it's the politics behind it.
Right. It's the political identity crisis it triggers behind the scenes in Medina.
And this is where the true legacy of leadership and the real complexity of human loyalty come into sharp focus.
Because before the Prophet's arrival, the Arab tribes of the Aus and Khazraj had these deep, multi-generational defense pacts with the Jewish tribes.
Yes, they relied on them for military backup, economic loans, trade, everything.
And now, one of those Jewish tribes has committed treason against the new state. So the Arab leaders of Medina are forced to make an impossible choice.
They have to choose between the safety nets of their ancestral past and the moral clarity of their new ideological future.
And we get this incredible contrast between two leaders from the Khazraj tribe, Ubadah ibn al-Samit and Abdullah ibn Ubay. Let's look at Ubadah first. How does he handle this crisis?
Well, Ubadah's response is the embodiment of a complete paradigm shift. The historical accounts note that he goes to the Prophet entirely of his own volition.
No one summons him.
No one demands his loyalty. He just walks in and explicitly, publicly renounces his old alliances with the Banu Qaynuqa. He states that his allegiance is solely to Allah, his messenger, and the believers.
He just severs the ties without a second thought.
Exactly. He recognizes that the Banu Qaynuqa broke the treaty and therefore his old tribal pact is null and void. He steps fully out of the old world.
But then we have Abdullah ibn Ubay.
Oh, Abdullah.
And Abdullah is such a fascinating, tragic figure. I mean, he had been slated to be the king of Medina before the Prophet arrived, so he has already lost his crown.
He's nursing a very bruised ego.
Yes, and he is driven entirely by a paralyzing fear of losing whatever leverage he has left.
Abdullah's actions during this crisis define the psychology of a hypocrite hedging his bets. He doesn't go to the Prophet to pledge loyalty like Ubadah did.
Of course not.
He goes to demand that his old allies, the Banu Qaynuqa, be spared. And he doesn't just ask politely as a mediator. He leverages his status and becomes aggressively physical.
The scene in the sources is incredibly tense. Abdullah approaches the Prophet and says, "O Muhammad, deal kindly with my client."
And the Prophet turns away from him, just ignoring the demand.
Right. Abdullah repeats it. The Prophet continues to ignore him. Then Abdullah steps forward and physically grabs the Prophet by his garment.
He literally grips his collar or his pocket and refuses to let go.
The audacity of that action cannot be overstated.
It's insane. He is physically assaulting the head of state, a prophet of God, in the middle of a military crisis.
And you can see the humanity in the Prophet's reaction. The narrator notes that the Prophet's face visibly darkens with anger.
Naturally.
He tells Abdullah, "Confound you, let me go." But Abdullah grips tighter. He says, "No, by Allah, I will not let you go until you deal kindly with my clients. 400 men without armor and 300 with armor who defended me from all, and you would mow them down in a single morning. I am a man who fears the turns of fortune."
I am a man who fears the turns of fortune. I mean, that single sentence is the absolute crux of his character.
It explains everything about him.
Abdullah wants the benefits of being associated with the victorious Muslims, but he has zero faith in their long-term survival. He looks at the geopolitical landscape, the Quraysh in Mecca preparing for war, the hostile tribes in the desert, and he thinks this Islamic State is going to be wiped out eventually.
And when that happens, I'm going to need these 700 fighters from the Banu Qaynuqa to protect me.
Exactly. It's pure self-preservation.
I want to push back on this a little bit, though, because while we label him a hypocrite, isn't his reaction just deeply human?
Well, yes and no.
I mean, we all want an insurance policy. When we leave a toxic job, we quietly keep the old boss's number just in case. When society feels unstable, we cling to flawed, corrupt power structures because the devil we know feels safer than the terrifying unknown of a new paradigm.
It is entirely human, which is why this account is so deeply resonant even today. Fear of the unknown is a universal instinct.
Right.
But the historical lesson here is about the cost of that fear. True transformation requires the courage to burn the ships.
You can't keep one foot in the past.
Exactly. Abdullah was so blinded by his fear of a hypothetical future that he couldn't see the reality of the present. He was betting on the losing horse, clinging to a tribe that had already surrendered and was under siege. He completely failed to recognize the divine and historical shift happening right in front of him.
And look at how the Prophet handles this blatant disrespect. He has been physically grabbed, yelled at, and his authority has been publicly challenged by a man prioritizing his own ego over the security of the state.
Legally, he could have had Abdullah executed for treason and mutiny right then and there.
But what does he do?
He demonstrates a legendary level of restraint. He swallows the personal insult to prevent a civil war.
Which is incredible leadership.
It is. He knows that Abdullah still has significant influence among the Khazraj. Executing him would fracture the internal unity they had just painstakingly preserved. So, to satisfy Abdullah and diffuse the immediate crisis, the Prophet says, "They are yours."
He lets the captives go.
He does.
But with a massive caveat. They are expelled from Medina, the Banu Qaynuqa are exiled, their military threat is neutralized, and Abdullah gets to keep his friends, but they are no longer in the city to protect him.
It is a masterstroke of leadership.
Truly mind-blowing. He navigates the ego of a terrified man, removes the immediate threat, and maintains the integrity of the state without shedding a single drop of blood inside the city.
But the ideological boundary was firmly drawn. Following this event, the sources point to verses of the Quran being revealed that directly address this psychology.
It admonished those who took allies outside the believers out of fear that a turn of fortune would strike them.
Right. It clarified that true protection and honor come from faith in unity, not from clinging to subversive factions out of cowardice.
So the internal fracture is managed. The physical threat of the Banu Qaynuqa is exiled. But the enemies of Medina realize that physical warfare and internal politics just aren't working.
They have to pivot.
So they shift to the most dangerous, insidious weapon in 7th century Arabia. They launch a massive, coordinated media war.
And this is perhaps the most complex and misunderstood dynamic of this era. To comprehend the threat, we have to return to the power of poetry, but this time on a geopolitical scale.
Right. In a completely oral society, poetry was the internet.
It was the news cycle, the historical archive, and the ultimate public relations machine.
We mentioned earlier how it could trigger tribal trauma. But let's look at how it functioned as a geopolitical weapon. We read these historical accounts, and they talk about poets as if they were weapons of mass destruction.
They absolutely were.
Explain how a poem actually destroyed a tribe.
Let's look at the classic example of the Banu Numayr. They were a proud, noble tribe. A famous poet named Jorir composed a single, highly satirical, perfectly metered verse about them.
Just one verse.
Just one verse. But it was so catchy, so devastatingly constructed that it spread across the desert like a virus. Caravans memorized it. Children sang it in the streets.
Wow.
Because of that single poem, members of the Banu Numayr were so ashamed they would literally lie about their lineage to strangers. A poem effectively erased their social standing in the region for generations.
It is the ultimate cancellation.
Yeah.
You can't issue a press release to counter it. You can't delete it from a server. Once it is memorized by the masses, it lives in the cultural ether permanently. And the man who wielded this weapon most effectively against the newly formed Islamic State was a figure named Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf.
Ka'b is a pivotal character in understanding the existential threats of this period, and the sources are very specific about his background, which is a crucial detail we really must analyze.
Yes, let's get into his background.
Ka'b was ethnically an Arab from the tribe of Tay. His mother, however, was from the Jewish tribe of Banu Nadir, and he grew up following her religion.
Right.
He lived in a formidable fortress, he was immensely wealthy, and he was considered one of the most eloquent and striking men in the region.
So he is basically a wealthy media mogul with a massive platform. And when the Muslims defeat the Quraysh at the Battle of Badr, Ka'b just loses his mind.
How completely loses it.
The sources say he was so devastated by the death of the Meccan nobility that he declared, if Muhammad has indeed slain these people, then the belly of the earth is better than its surface. He decides that life is not worth living if the Muslims are victorious.
So he activates his platform. But he doesn't just stay in Medina and grumble. He commits an act of explicit treason.
What does he do?
He leaves the jurisdiction of Medina, crosses the desert, and goes directly to Mecca, the very city that had just been at war with Medina.
He goes behind enemy lines.
Yes.
And he doesn't just offer condolences while he's there. He writes deeply moving, sorrowful poetry eulogizing the dead Meccan leaders, and he recites it to the Quraysh.
He is actively stoking their grief.
Yes. He fans the flames of their humiliation and actively incites them to raise a new, larger army to march on Medina and wipe the Muslims out.
He is acting as a foreign agent. He's coordinating an international military alliance against his own city.
Which is treason in any era.
By any standard of ancient or modern law, an individual who travels to a hostile nation to incite a military invasion against his home state is a combatant committing high treason.
But his campaign of destruction doesn't stop there. He returns to Medina, protected by his fortress and his wealth, and he crosses a line that was considered absolute poison in Arab culture.
The worst possible line you could cross.
He begins composing and widely disseminating deeply suggestive, explicit, and dishonorable poetry, specifically targeting the Muslim women.
The psychological violence of this act is profound. You know, in a society where honor, modesty, and reputation were the absolute currency of life, having the women of your community publicly degraded by a master poet was a devastating blow.
Because everyone is repeating these poems?
Yes, he was naming them. He was describing them in ways designed to humiliate the men, break the morale of the community, and provoke a reckless, violent response.
It's narrative warfare at its most depraved. He is cutting at the roots of their society, creating an atmosphere of intense fear and humiliation.
And the sources note that this campaign harmed the prophet immensely, not just personally, but because it was a direct assault on the dignity of his people.
So the prophet makes a decision. He asks his companions, who will deal with Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf? For he has harmed Allah and his messenger.
A group of men volunteer, led by Muhammad ibn Maslama.
And what follows is a tense, highly calculated clandestine operation. Because they know they cannot simply march an army to Ka'b's fortress.
No, that would ignite a full-scale civil war within Medina. They have to neutralize the threat strategically.
So Muhammad ibn Maslama goes to Ka'b, and he uses deception. He complains about the prophet. He says, this man has demanded charity from us. He has brought us nothing but trouble and economic hardship.
He pretends to be disgruntled to win Ka'b's trust.
He even offers to leave his weapons with Ka'b as collateral for a loan of food.
And I really want to address the ethical mechanics of this, as it is a point of frequent historical analysis. The use of deception here is a recognized rule of engagement in warfare.
Exactly.
The prophet explicitly stated that war is deceit. Ka'b was not a civilian expressing a dissenting opinion.
He wasn't just a guy with a blog.
No. He was an active combatant who had engaged in espionage, incited a foreign army, and utilized psychological warfare to destabilize the state. The deception used by Muhammad ibn Maslama was a tactical maneuver to isolate a high-value military target without causing collateral damage.
That distinction is so important. If someone is actively organizing an army to kill your families, you don't send them a calendar invite for a duel. You neutralize the threat.
Exactly.
So the operation proceeds. They arrange to meet Ka'b at night outside his fortress.
And the details recorded are incredibly cinematic and tense. Ka'b, smelling of rich perfumes, prepares to leave his fortress in the dark.
His wife actually senses the danger.
She does. She begs him not to go. She says she hears a voice that sounds like blood dripping.
But Ka'b's arrogance and his false sense of security completely override her warning. He believes these men are desperate and turning against the prophet.
So he walks down to meet them.
They walk together for a while, just conversing. Muhammad ibn Maslama compliments the beautiful scent of Ka'b's perfume and asks if he can smell his hair.
Ka'b, flattered, allows it.
Muhammad does it a second time, getting closer, securing his grip. And then he yells to his companions, strike! And they assassinate him right there in the dark.
The threat is neutralized. The propaganda machine is dismantled.
But the most crucial analytical point we must extract from this event, a point the sources take great care to emphasize, is the motivation behind it. Why was Ka'b executed?
Right, because history can be so easily twisted into narratives of prejudice.
Exactly. The source makes it crystal clear. This was not a racial or ethnic purge.
The text explicitly reminds us that Ka'b was ethnically an Arab. He was not targeted because of his mother's religion, nor was he targeted for simply disagreeing with the prophet.
No. He was targeted solely because of his active campaign of subversion, his treasonous incitement of the Meccan army, and his brutal, relentless propaganda against the civilian women of the community.
It was a surgical defense of the newly established societal boundaries. The Muslims were defending the honor and the physical survival of their society against a man utilizing his immense wealth and platform to coordinate their annihilation.
It really highlights the heavy, often grim responsibility of leadership. The prophet had a duty to protect his people not just from swords on a battlefield, but from profound psychological and reputational destruction.
It fundamentally reshapes how we view historical conflict in this era. Not all battles are fought with armies lined up in the sand.
Right. Sometimes the most existential threats to a society come through whispered alliances in the marketplace.
Through the exploitation of old traumas.
And through the deliberate erosion of a community's moral fabric via mass media.
It's a timeless struggle.
Let's just take a breath and zoom out.
Yeah.
When you look at the sheer magnitude of what was achieved during this brief window of the Medina period, it leaves you with a profound sense of awe.
It truly does.
We started this conversation talking about how history is never a clean blueprint. What we've explored today is a masterpiece of human endurance painted in the middle of a hurricane.
The legacy of this leadership isn't merely survival. Any tyrant can survive by ruling with an iron fist, just crushing all dissent with terror. The true legacy is how the community survived.
It's the emotional intelligence to walk into a crowd of armed, furious men ready to resume a blood feud and to diffuse that rage with tears and a reminder of love rather than threats of execution.
It is the supernatural patience to let a terrified, hypocritical man like Abdullah ibn Uyabay grab you by the collar, assault your dignity in public, and still prioritize the long-term stability of the community over your own ego.
It is the brilliance of drafting a covenant of equal citizenship in a world that only understood domination by the sword.
It is managing the heartbreaking tragedy of men who looked at the truth, recognized it with absolute certainty, and chose the path of hatred anyway.
And it is having the decisive strength to draw a hard line against the world's original media wars, protecting the honor of the vulnerable from those who would use words as weapons of mass destruction.
The emotional and psychological legacy of this leadership is precisely what makes him the greatest man who ever lived. He didn't just conquer territories, he conquered the deepest, most toxic flaws in human nature to build a community of unprecedented resilience and loyalty.
The transformation of Medina from a fractured, traumatized, feuding city into a cohesive, unshakable state under such immense psychological and physical pressure is historically unparalleled.
It required a level of conviction, empathy, and strategic genius that continues to demand our deepest study.
It really does. And it leaves us with so much to reflect on. Because while the setting of our lives is entirely different, we don't live in 7th century Medina, we aren't facing sieges in our local marketplaces, or navigating ancient tribal blood feuds, the psychological forces at play, those haven't changed one bit.
Human nature is the ultimate constant in history. The tools change, but the underlying mechanisms of ego, fear, and manipulation remain exactly the same.
We all deal with the poetry of our modern age. We face the relentless media cycles, the viral rumors, the narratives algorithmically designed to scratch at our deepest traumas and divide us from our neighbors.
We absolutely do.
We all face crucial moments where we have to choose between the comfortable, familiar safety nets of our past, like Abdullah ibn Ubay, or the terrifying but morally clear path of the future, like Ubada. We all experience cognitive dissonance, where our pride desperately battles against the truth we know in our hearts.
That is the daily human struggle.
So based on the awe-inspiring, emotionally profound example set during this fragile period, I want to leave you with the final thought to mull over. As you navigate the complexities of your own life, ask yourself, are the words you consume every day and the alliances you hold on to out of fear actively building a unified community around you? Or are they quietly, invisibly pulling you to the past?